They sleep side by side under a large outcropping of rock, trying to block out the humidity with clothes and blankets, the torch tucked between them. It's a nest that resembles more what a pair of cats might make out of rags, but it works for the time being, and with her feet tucked into a pile of shirts, and the solid presence of her suitcase at her side, Dinah feels quite warm. In a small ledge just above them, Kiki nestles uncomfortably for the night. Jack falls asleep quickly, on his back, head turned slightly away from her. His red hair falls nearly to his eyes, and in the pale light, his freckles fade into his skin. There are two tiny, new scars on his chin that she has never seen before, maybe from an encounter with a bird gone wrong, or just from shaving. It's strange, to think that so much has happened to him and she hasn't been there to see any of it. It's strange to think that they've grown into adulthood so far apart. In the distance, Dinah hears nocturnal birds calling out to each other. Were he awake, Jack surely would have known their names. As it is, though, Dinah just curls to her side, suitcase at her back, and lets her head rest near his shoulder. Perhaps, some years back, she might have rested her head on his arm. But they aren't children anymore. Dinah wakes up to the sound of Kiki singing "Don't Forget the Gumdrops," Mum loudly, as if an ad for a wireless program is playing in the distance. For a moment, she feels utterly displaced, and nearly hits her head against the rock above as she tries to sit up. The light just beyond is bright, and the space beside her is cold. When she emerges, she sees that the mist has left during the night, and she would never have guessed that it's the same place they chose to camp in the night before. The grey, wet-looking rock is suddenly rich brown and full of hardy life cropping out from between the cracks, birds pecking here and there in ridges higher up. The sky seems to have opened up completely, dark grey turned to pale white with patches of blue here and there, entire formations of birds soaring in the distance. And there's a horizon, finally. The cliffs look out towards blue water, cold, crashing waves that push and pull at rocky beaches below. The air is full of salt, and the wind is as comforting as it is cool, the smell of craggy tops, of being nearly home. She finds Jack lying on a rock, binoculars glued to his eyes. Kiki lets out a happy noise when she approaches, and Jack just grins, not moving his gaze from the birds that are circling above. He points to a half-eaten bag of biscuits. "Found them in my bag, they're still good," he says. "I figured they'd do for a nice outdoors breakfast." Biting back a smile, Dinah takes some and sits down at his side. She's chewing on one of the rather dry biscuits and giving half of one to Kiki, when whatever Jack's looking at flies away and his binoculars finally leave his face. "Morning," he grins up at her. "Morning." As it turns out, Craggy Tops is much further south than they had hoped, but it's not an impossible distance to walk, not for two people accustomed to long unwanted stays in the wilderness. At any rate, Dinah estimates that they'll reach Craggy Tops the next morning at the latest, which makes for a rather hungry time, honestly, but not an unbearably horrid one. The way down from the cliff is simple enough in theory, although in practice it's a much more treacherous affair. Jack goes first, and for the first few minutes all she can see is his red hair, Kiki's pole, and his rucksack bobbing up and down as he finds their way down the rocky path. Dinah is unceremonious. As soon as they're relatively close to level ground, she kicks her suitcase down ahead of her, and picks it up again only once she's reached the bottom. They share the last of the water about an hour later and then fill their bottles in a small waterfall that springs from the rock, lounging against a wall of moss, already able to glimpse the thin line of the ocean ahead. It shan't take them much longer to reach the beach. "I don't want to work in sales all my life," Dinah admits, once she's caught her breath from the cold water. It leaves her in a rush, like a confession. Jack looks at her from over the water bottle, eyebrows raised in askance. "I'm going to study geography?" She waits for Jack to reply, but he only looks at her in expectant silence, devoid of any skepticism or derision. The idea, previously guarded to protect the sanctity of such a fragile idea, spills out of her. It might be silly to get caught up in thoughts of the future, especially given their objectively grave situation in the cliffs, but she can't help it. The plan isn't one she's shared with anyone, really, except perhaps in a few vague allusions to Lucy Ann once in a letter. But now, with Jack listening, it seems to blossom. "Did you know that there are less than a dozen female geographers in England?" They've started new programs in Cambridge and Oxford, and there's a Society of Women Explorers in America. I think that if I try, I might be admitted to a university, and become a geographer. It'd be quite different from sales, of course, but I want this. I think you'd be incredible, Jack says with a grin. Do it. Maybe we'd be able to get out of these cliffs faster. It's a year of new beginnings, I suppose, she says without thinking. The intensity of the statement is not lost on him, she knows, but she moves away before she can see his expression. It isn't the time to speak of what awaits them in Craggy Tops, not now. But the weight of it settles hard on her shoulders, and it's not until they're already following a rocky makeshift path to the beach that there's any conversation. Have you told Aunt Ally yet? I expect she'll support me, and Bill would be delighted, I'm sure. But I feel like Mother's always felt a bit strange about the way I've decided to live. She herself didn't want to work. You see, given the chance, she'd have been at home with us. I think there's a part of her that thinks I'd be better off with the same. I don't think she'd hold you back, Jack says, brow furrowed. She's proud of you, and anyway I don't think getting married could keep you away from a career. Dinah snorts. If there ever were a man who'd be happy marrying a working scientist, that is. Beaus are different, but marriage. She is, after all, a challenge. The temperamental and cold girl all men want to conquer, as if they'd earn a medal. A medal that still isn't quite valuable enough to them. My lifestyle isn't exactly convenient. You want to live in the city. I don't care where I live. I just want to know that I can have dreams beyond learning to cook pumpkin pie, or getting a twin-tub washing machine. That I'm more than that. You are more than that. Behind her, Jack is smiling at her, and the fondness in his eyes makes her heart ache. It's been far too long since she's had a chance to speak to him like this. What about you? She finds herself asking, as he finally falls into step with her. The path is no longer so narrow. He gives her a wry look. Do I look like marriage material to you? I travel the world looking for birds, I don't wear a suit, or drive a car, or have a house. It'd be unfair for any woman. There's a thick stretch of vegetation as they near the water, mist and waterfall and ocean having settled to create the perfect scenario for life to thrive. It's a scratchy, tall pile of life, Dinah finds, pushing her way through the grassy patch. Being tall, Jack can see where they're going, and he holds onto her shoulder as if he's worried she'll get lost, but she's the one who spots the holes in the ground, burrows of some sort, and steers them away from them until they've finally emerged on the other side, and the dirt gives way to pebbles again. I think it's stupid, Dinah tells him bluntly, suddenly. He looks at her, puzzled. What is? You don't need to have a suit or a car any more than I have to be excited about Formica worktops or washing machines. It's stupid. Jack grins. They follow the birds to the ocean. Dinah has always suspected that Jack doesn't need binoculars at all. His eyes can spot any bird at any distance and he can name them, regardless of how far away they are. He calls out names to her and to the world in general as he sprints down the last of the steep path, as if he's introducing her to old friends. In a way, he is, Dinah thinks. He used to do much of the same thing when they lived here. Kiki soars above them, telling the other birds not to forget their gumdrops. And what a noise, what a noise. There isn't sand, this beach is rocky for a few miles yet, but Dinah peels her jumper off nonetheless and lets it flutter in the air behind her, the taste of salt on her lips. Jack is a red dot in the distance, wheeling around like a bird himself as he catches sight of new ones perched atop tall pillars of rock. She doesn't want to reach Craggy Tops, she realizes suddenly. She wants to stay like this, even with the mild hunger gnawing at her stomach, and the humidity sinking into her skin. Here, it doesn't matter what life is like in the city, or at home. Here, reduced to nature and the never-ending cycles of life, she need not worry about the future, or about herself, or about whether it's selfish of her to begrudge Lucienne and Philip their happiness, to weigh it against her peace of mind. The wind pulls her hair around her head, and it cuts against her cheeks, stinging and salty. She is nothing but sensation, and the sight of Jack running ahead of her, calling out birds the same way he always does. Eventually, he falls into step with her, fingers still closed around his binoculars, his green eyes bright. Black and white birds fly overhead and settle down on the cliffs nearby, mingling with each other. "I don't generally get to do this, you know," Jack tells her. "Do what?" "Have another human near me while I watch them." He glances up at the sky, at the circling birds, their razor bills like the ones from yesterday. She realizes, come to nest in the cliffs. "Well, if they travel in pairs, you should too," Dinah replies. If he keeps his gaze on her a bit longer than usual, she pretends she doesn't notice. There is a lot that goes unsaid, after all, she realizes, as they stop to rest again, this time with their feet dangling in the water. It's windy, but it's not so cold anymore. The salty wind chills her cheeks, but Jack's arm is warm against hers, and it's comfortable in a way no other company has ever been, really. No other man would dare sit so close, nor would any other man feel so familiar wandering the cliffs day and night in a sudden, wild adventure. There is a lot that the four of them can do that no one else possibly could. Jack talks about birds a lot, but also about Australia, and he asks her about the city in a way that feels oddly ornithological anyway, which is amusing. Sometimes she wonders if he looks at people the same way that he looks at birds. But no. His gaze is fixed on hers intently, and when he grabs her elbow to make sure she's steady as she stands up to stretch, it doesn't feel patronizing. Instead, he follows it up by looking down at the water. "How deep, do you reckon?" "Too deep," she laughs. And it is, probably. Which is likely the only reason Jack waits until they reach the sandy beach in the early afternoon to take on the waves. The beach is a pale sliver of white against the muted gray of land, and as soon as they set foot on it everything is warmer, the weakest sunlight intensified tenfold by the brightness of the ground beneath them. Dinah kicks off her shoes and digs her toes into it. It's full of small rocks that dig pleasantly into her skin, like a peculiar massage. The suitcase ends up half buried beside Jack's rucksack, and when she looks up he's already sprinting towards the water, calling for her over his shoulder, and she finds herself following just as eagerly. Yes, there are many unsaid things between them. Like the fact that she isn't shocked when he takes off his shirt, even though the sight of his exposed skin surprises her, and she's never really seen him like this since they were children. Like the fact that it just feels natural when he threads his fingers through hers and pulls her deeper into the cold water, and she shivers in the cold and laughs and laughs. Like the way his green eyes are fixed on hers the entire time, his head tilted towards her, not towards Kiki, when Jack's head has always been closer to birds than it is to humans. They wade deeper into the cold water until it doesn't feel cold anymore, and Dinah pushes her hair back so it doesn't stick to her face, and closes her eyes. Jack's fingers are around hers, and she wonders at the fact that she doesn't ever want to let go. "The others would have liked this," he says eventually, when she opens her eyes. He's staring southwards, towards where Craggy Tops awaits. "We should bring them here, too," Dinah replies, ignoring the unease in her stomach. "Later." And she means it, really, even if it's her own weakness that keeps the reluctance in her alive. Because this might be her and Jack's place, now, in an odd way, but it's not theirs completely until the four of them are here. "Later," he repeats, and for a moment his gaze lingers, until he's dragging her underwater and she's trying not to choke on water and laughter. In the end, their clothes dry in the wind as they climb back up the beach towards the rocks, leaving them shivering but no longer sopping wet. Jack has pulled his shirt back on, but as he reaches the end of the beach, he lets out a loud, boyish whoop. Dinah flings a shoe at him. Their time spent swimming has its consequences, and sunset comes before they have any hope of catching sight of Craggy Tops. Dinah wants to believe that the fact disappoints her, but there is only so much lying one can do to oneself. Instead of wasting time on such thoughts, she finds a clump of rather scratchy brambles that is somewhat sheltered from the wind and makes a nest of blankets and clothes there. Jack, in the meantime, strokes Kiki's pole and replies to her nonsense with words of his own. It's an oddly calm image against the backdrop of Dinah's raging emotions. Being just the two of them, the absence of Philip and Lucy Ann is far from painful. After all, they've lived apart for a long time, but it is evident. This is not the same adventure they might have had it been all four of them here. This is a creature of its own, the sort of adventure neither of them have had before. Not dangerous, perhaps, but strange. Not uncomfortable, not at all, but it has taken on a dynamic that Diana isn't quite sure she's ready to analyze. And somewhere out there in the darkness, her brother and Jack's sister are together in the emptiness of Craggy Tops. She makes her way to Jack. The shoes are back on her feet, but they feel all wrong now, with sand from the beach between her toes. Jack has his torch in hand, and sets it on the rock beside him, illuminating their surroundings as much as possible. "Do you ever get lonely?" Jack asks suddenly. "Living alone, in the city?" "Well, the city is full of people, Jack," Diana says teasingly. She expects Jack to roll his eyes, but instead he's frowning pensively. "I've wondered," he says, in an odd voice. "If it was just me." "Just you?" "I'm not a people's person," he says. "But it's not the same, when it's with Tufty, or Lucienne, or you." He kicks at a pebble towards the edge of the cliff, and it disappears into the dark. "It's different, somehow. Easy. And I know I can't possibly expect any of you to travel with me, that would be mad, but..." He trails off, but Diana understands it in a fundamental sort of way, like Jack has put into words something she hasn't quite been able to say herself, in the days when the gaping emptiness of the city struggles to overwhelm her. It clutches at her heart and twists tighter and tighter around it, until she almost wants to gasp. But the world's isn't an adventure without you. It hangs there, unspoken, and Diana wants to pluck it from the air and say it, but her mouth can't muster the words. She thinks of him, far off in Australia, wandering the wilderness with only Kiki for company. Perhaps there are some who go with him, photographers or other ornithologists, sharing the same passion and skills. But it isn't the same. Jack, the boy with the red hair and the green eyes and the freckles and this almost unhealthy obsession with birds, so unbearably far away from the only ones that could possibly understand. And herself, sitting in the office, perhaps in a pub if her friends managed to persuade her, at dinner parties and chatting with roommates and carrying out errands and paperwork, so much paperwork. The intensity, the rush of independence and competence and efficiency and... "It's not just you," she says finally, and her voice sounds strangled. Jack's head is tilted towards her again, and his hand reaches out, brushes against her shoulder, so familiar. "You could come back," he says quietly. And she knows the comment isn't meant for her. He's repeating a memory of what he's been saying to himself, the reluctant dreams of a traveler, the option he knows he himself could never settle for. You could come back home. Home, to the cottage that hasn't been her home for 3 years, although it holds half of the people she holds dearest. Home, where both she and Jack know their natures could not possibly allow them to stay, where adventure, however present it is in their lives and in their characters, cannot seem to exist the way it did when they were all children together. Home, where Philip and Lucienne have found a connection that the rest of them have not, have bonded themselves to each other in a way that Diana cannot begin to fathom the repercussions of. The words escape her before she can stop them, as if the sentence had formed ages ago, even while she was still on the train. "I think Philip and Lucienne might get married." The strangeness of the sentence on her own lips nearly makes her flinch. Kiki nibbles on the collar of Jack's shirt, but Jack doesn't react. He turns and looks at Diana, and in the darkness she suddenly wishes he were closer, so that she might examine the emotions on his face. As it is, she has to make do with barely the light of the torch. "I think so too," he says. And he looks so calm that Diana feels a fierce flare of frustration and shame. "Do you approve?" She swallows. "I don't think there could be anything better. Because it does make sense, all those years going on amazing adventures together, and then only Philip and Lucienne living mere hours away from each other, corresponding often, seeing each other often, both grown from the children they used to be. It isn't surprising at all. She can't possibly imagine either Philip or Lucienne settling for anything less, and she certainly can't imagine someone else joining them. And yet, how can it? She struggles for breath, suddenly, as if the question is choking her. How can it still be the 4 of us? Jack frowns. It'll always be the 4 of us. She shakes her head, and hates herself for it. But she's begun already, so she might as well continue. But it won't be the same, Jack, can't you see? I know this is more than any of us could hope for, and I'm terribly happy, but I can't help it. I know they would never mean it, but this changes everything. It makes her sick to speak the truth so openly, to reveal both the ugliness of the facts and the ugliness of her own emotions. It disgusts her, and it terrifies her to have him so close to her, looking in. She's suddenly terrified of seeing her emotions reflected in his eyes. "I'm a horrid person, aren't I?" she asks quietly. Jack is looking at her, but he's calm, collected, utterly unworried. There's nothing but compassion there. "You're a better person than I am," she concludes, and she can feel the tears in her eyes. "No," he says simply. "I've just always known." "Known what?" "That this was going to happen, and that it wasn't going to happen to me." The sentence registers in her mind too slowly, and she knows she will have to analyze it later. But suddenly Jack's arms are around her and her face is buried in the crook of his neck and he's warm, impossibly so in the cold air of the cliffs. The sob tears itself out of her chest and through her throat, and it sounds so pathetic against the night air that Dinah wants to crumple with shame at the sound of it. "I don't want to lose it," she whispers. "I don't want to walk into that house and see that it's gone." Because home has always been the four of them together, the one space where she has a place, a role, where she doesn't have to be intimidating or ladylike or any of the blasted labels anyone tries to place on her, where she can be with them, and know that they'll want to be with her, and where no one is left aside, where no two are paired off with the privilege of loving more somehow. "This is where it's always been leading us to, Dinah," Jack says quietly. "All of it, since the day all four of us met. We haven't lost it, it's just grown." 88,888,888. Darkness falls, and Dinah can't sleep. Kiki is a pale shadow perched on a skeletal bush nearby, and Jack is a warm presence at her side, his face turned towards her as he sleeps, one hand resting on his stomach. He must have been tired. Now, he looks oddly statuesque in the pale moonlight that barely filters through the clouds. If she closes her eyes, she can feel his breath against her forehead, warm and steady. It's not much different from times they've camped together before, as children in a cave when they were stranded on a valley, on an island full of puffins, or heavens knows where else, when the four of them went on adventures. Except this time Lucienne and Philip aren't here, and so many things have changed. And Dinah can't sleep. But it's not about Philip and Lucienne, really. It never was, not exactly. It's about things staying the same, about still finding that adventure, about being the Dinah that went to the valley, and the island, and the circus, and the mountain, on all of those adventures. She's not really the girl she was back then, quarreling with Philip and exploring caves, but that girl isn't quite gone, either. She's here, nestled in the bushes with Jack, feet sore from climbing cliffs, hair stiff from the salt of the ocean, still a part of the working woman she's become. We haven't lost it, it's just grown. Turning, she finds herself facing Jack's sleeping face and closes her eyes. The air outside isn't so cold, but she burrows deeper into the blankets nonetheless, her knees tucked against his leg. It's strange, she supposes, for two adults to find themselves in a situation like this one, but it also doesn't feel strange at all. She closes her eyes, and she isn't quite sure if she manages to sleep or not, opening her eyes now and again to see the brambles shivering in another direction, or Jack turn over in his sleep, once to give his back to her, a second time to face her again. The night feels long, but Dinah likes it this way, infinite and comfortable, like a Sunday morning that never seems to end, where sleep is a soft cushion away from reality, where craggy tops remains far, far away. The breeze pushes Jack's hair away from his face, and the sky is growing lighter, and Dinah can almost see how red it is, can almost make out the freckles on his nose and cheek, trace the line of them all the way up to his ears. He has stubble that skims his cheekbones and settles around his mouth. He mustn't have had a chance to shave in the last 2 days. How must he have looked, traveling Australia with Kiki on his shoulder, and in other foreign countries the times before that? When he first left, to go to Scotland, had he seemed like the boy that she knew, even under the beard? Probably. Dinah realizes that she would like to know firsthand. To be a geographer, and study the strange places of the earth and what made them the way they are. To see Jack study birds. To hold his hand, in the ocean, to feel connected. Because that is what they are, connected. Irrevocably. For life. And Dinah knows, suddenly, that Jack has known this all along. Consciously or unconsciously, he's known it, in the way he's looked at her and talked to her, in the way he's crossed the world to get back to the three of them, and hasn't blinked twice at being caught in the wilderness with her. In the way the very science he understands to track the birds all around them points to Dinah, to the fact that Dinah, as impulsive and imposing as she seems to be, might naturally come to the same conclusions, and come to see how all of this has grown, and what it has grown into. That this was going to happen, and that it wasn't going to happen to me. For all his wisdom, Jack is still an idiot. A humble idiot, thinking that he's somehow undesirable for his love of birds, and his lack of a suit and a car. An idiot to think that that somehow keeps him away from what he himself has termed inevitable. Because you can't expect people to go through so much together and remain less than in love with each other. Because it's only natural. Because that's where it's always been leading them to. Heart pounding, Dinah sits up. The cold air hits her suddenly, and she shivers. At her side, Jack seems to feel the shift in temperature and moves slightly, pressing his cheek harder onto the sweater that has been their pillow, but he doesn't wake up. Dinah is alone, and the sky is slowly turning blue. She feels a mad sense of urgency, as if she herself were an ornithologist and found the rarest bird in existence, perched directly in front of them, ready to be seen and studied and photographed. And Jack knows. He must know, he must have felt it as well, all this time at her side, in the way he's touched her and the way he knows her. But he's Jack, she reminds herself suddenly. He's Jack, and he doesn't know a thing about approaching such a subject. Dinah has always been the outspoken one. So she acts upon the thought, before her fears have a chance to catch up with her. She reaches out and shakes him awake, her heart racing. Jack blinks blearily in the almost darkness, his hand leaving his side to touch her arm. "What is it?" he murmurs, voice slurred by sleep. "Dinah?" And Dinah presses forward and leans down and touches his lips with hers, stubble rough against her skin and his suddenly pounding heart warm against her chest. And she's trembling terribly, but she couldn't care less. Jack wakes up quickly after that, reaching up and taking her by her upper arms and pulling her back slightly, his breath leaving him in quick, surprised gusts. His eyes are so green, even in the shadows, and they stare at her like she's a stranger, suddenly, like he's not sure if he knows her, and for a moment, she falters. "You said you've always known," she says weakly. "That it could only be us." "Us?" Jack's voice is trembling almost as much as she is. He pushes himself up on his elbows, suddenly, letting go of her. His chest is rising and falling rapidly, and his wide eyes terrify her. "I think," she feels unsteady without him holding her, but she knows, doesn't she? To not say it would be to lie. "I think I've always..." But Jack's expression changes, and the words die in her mouth, because it's impossible to say them, and anyway Jack knows. Jack has always known, and she can tell from the way his confusion and shock turn to disbelief and genuine, overwhelming relief. He reaches towards her and suddenly his hand is on the back of her neck, and their lips are brushing against each other, and he feels so much like home that she aches for him. "Dinah," he says, his lips shaking against hers, like he can't quite believe it, like she's a miracle. "Dinah." She presses her hands against his chest and her fingers against the collar of his shirt, and he falls back until she's lying over him, and his hands are in her hair and his lips are scorching against her own, and maybe it's mad to do this so quickly, but hasn't it been years, and hasn't this been where it's always led them, anyway? Jack touches her like he has never known anything quite like her, and perhaps he hasn't, and perhaps that makes Dinah feel a little less lost, suddenly, kissing down the line of his throat and feeling her own veins come alive. And when her fingers brush against his bare ribs he gasps against her mouth and the sound of it goes straight through her, until she pushes the blankets aside, and it feels. She doesn't know where to touch first, her pulse is racing, and soon she's watching the lightning sky over them, Jack's mouth hot against her ear and then her clavicle, her own hands rushed against the buttons of her shirt, against the scrape of his trousers, against the muscles of his back. Jack holding himself up by the elbows and groaning into her neck like finally dash. His trousers are open and her hand is on him and he's panting against her mouth, eyes squeezed shut, his fingers against the pounding of her heart. He gasps, meeting her gaze, wide and desperate and so full of affection it could make her cry. Dinah. Dinah kisses him over and over, until her lips feel bruised from it and he's shaking, and she kisses him as he buries his face in her neck, as he is hers, in her arms, whispering her name. Then he kisses her neck again, as if to soothe the scrape of his stubble on her, and his mouth finds her heartbeat, and his hands explore her. No one else has ever known her the way Jack does, has kissed her the way Jack does, has stroked her the way he does, firmly and confidently and gently and lovingly, like she's a country that needs exploring and yet is also his homeland, like she is everything. This is what it was meant to become, hands shaking against his back and muscles tensing around his fingers, his red hair against her cheek and the warmth of him almost too beautiful to bear. And it's not about Philip and Lucy Ann finding their way to each other, although their epiphany might have accelerated her own, because it would have happened regardless, with the right combination of time and ocean and mounting frustration, because they are the answers to each other, just like they were as children. Because no one else could possibly know what this feels like, together, Jack and Dinah, against rough rock and city clothes, overlooking the sea. Afterwards, she lies there for a long time, watching the rising sun touch every one of the shades of red in his hair. He keeps a hand on her hip, almost as if losing contact might suddenly make him float away. "Do you remember," she says sleepily, "when you all arrived at the station that first day, and we went in Jojo's horrid old car? I thought you looked like a wildcat," Jack replies with a grin, though his eyes stay closed. She smacks him on the head, and his grin widens. "You looked like a circus trainer to me, with Kiki on your shoulder like that." People do tend to think that. The sky is grayish-orange, and Kiki is awake in a nearby bush, chewing on something. She seems to studiously avoid looking at them, and Dinah stifles a rather embarrassed laugh. At her side, Jack finally stirs and reaches into for a biscuit, giving it to Kiki. He looks down at Dinah then, and presses a kiss to the corner of her mouth. "We should keep walking." They make their way through the last of the cliffs hand in hand, and when the sun is high in the sky, they turn a corner, and there it is, tall and grandiose in its odd, ugly way. The one tower that had once stood against all winds is now partly fallen in, and the massive grey stones are covered in blackish, greenish plant life, the roof scattered with evidence of past bird nests. But it's still the same old house that was once full of adventure, craggy tops. At the edge of the rocks, Dinah sets down her suitcase. Jack, having climbed down to the sandy floor beyond, halts and looks up at her. The wind tears through their hair and clothes, and the cries of the birds are loud all around them, and Jack looks happier than she thinks she's ever seen him. "Well, I suppose we've reached the end of the adventure," he says, perhaps sensing the finality in her eyes. Kiki flies ahead of them, as if she remembers the place, and she sings "Polly Put the Kettle On," which perhaps confirms it. Aunt Polly and Uncle Jocelyn are long gone, but Philip and Lucy Ann should be here, and perhaps there is some remnant of home to be found in the old bones of the house. And between her and Jack, in a way, nothing has changed, except she's not scared anymore. "Just the first of many," Dinah replies, and reaches for his hand. Jack calls out as they approach the house, Kiki circling the tower window, screeching. And by the time Dinah and Jack are breathlessly hurrying towards the door, racing each other like children, there's a loud whoop and the door is pulled open, and there is Philip, grinning widely, calling for Lucy Ann over his shoulder. The old tower room from their childhood has lost its roof, but they don't mind. Now they have the added benefit of being able to see the stars, and anyway at this point Dinah thinks she'd miss them if she couldn't see them. Philip keeps an arm around her as Lucy Ann pulls out the goods they've brought with them to eat, somewhat uncharacteristically affectionate, but Dinah doesn't mind. Perhaps Philip can sense the change too, and the magnitude of what has happened. She doesn't know quite what to say to her brother when he hasn't told her anything out loud yet, but the way he looks at Lucy Ann says everything she needs to know. It's nice to be like this and hug Philip, so nice that she almost doesn't mind the mouse that peeks out of his shirt to sniff at her as she does so. They prepare toast over a little fire in what used to be their bedroom, years ago, on the eve of their first adventure. As they eat, Philip is hovering near Lucy Ann at all times, a hand on her lower back, helping her butter the toast and hand out plates, and if they notice Dinah and Jack sitting closer to each other than usual, they don't say anything. And when Jack has got the little fire crackling in front of them, and they're all huddled in blankets next to each other, and Philip and Lucy Ann announce their engagement over steaming cups of tea, it feels like the most natural thing in the world. Things shall change, shan't they? Lucy Ann muses finally, a piece of toast in hand. They shall, Jack says, smiling. He looks up at the stars above them, and Dinah feels his hand squeeze hers tightly under the blanket. But not just yet. Right now it's just us four, and jolly old Craggy Tops. And Kiki. Philip says, reaching out to scratch the bird's poll. And Kiki, Jack laughs, and Kiki joins in. As Lucy Ann reaches for some tinned fruit she claims to have brought for tradition's sake, Jack's fingers stretch over Dinah's, entwining with hers. Outside the tower room, the wind still whispers as excitedly as it did in their childhood, and it sounds like adventure.